The evening sun cast long shadows across the airport terminal as passengers lined up at Gate 23 for the red-eye flight to Denver. Among them stood a woman in her mid-50s, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, nothing that would make her stand out in the crowd of business travelers and vacationers eager to board. Her name tag, partially hidden beneath her blazer, read Dr. Eleanor Chen, though most people who knew her simply called her Ellie. As the gate agent called for passengers in zones 1 and 2 to board, Ellie gathered her worn leather messenger bag and joined the line. Boarding pass for seat 12F clutched in her hand. "Good evening," she said with a polite smile to the flight attendant at the door. Her voice carried a slight trace of an accent that had softened over decades in the States. The attendant returned her smile with the practiced warmth of someone 8 hours into their shift. "Welcome aboard. Seat 12F is down the aisle on your right, just past the wing." Ellie nodded her thanks and made her way down the narrow aisle, careful not to bump other passengers with her bag. A young man struggling to fit his overstuffed backpack into the overhead bin stepped aside to let her pass. "Sorry about that," he said, still wrestling with his bag. "No rush," Ellie replied, waiting patiently. People often mistook her patience for timidity, but those who knew her understood it came from a lifetime of precision work, where rushing led to mistakes. When she finally reached row 12, a businessman in an expensive suit was already settled into seat 12D, the aisle seat. He barely glanced up from his tablet as Ellie gestured to the window seat. "Excuse me, I'm in 12F." With a barely concealed sigh, the man stood to let her pass. Ellie slid into her seat, tucking her bag beneath the seat in front of her instead of using the overhead bin. Old habits of keeping important items close at hand died hard. Through the window, she watched ground crew load the last of the luggage. Their practiced movements reminded her of her own team from years ago, each person with a specific role, precise timing, and no wasted motion. 25 years had passed since then, but some memories never faded. The middle seat remained empty as the boarding process continued. Ellie took out a paperback mystery novel and her reading glasses, settling in for the 3-hour flight. The businessman beside her had already put in earbuds, creating an invisible wall between them. That suited Ellie just fine. She preferred anonymity these days. As the final passengers boarded, the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Ellie listened attentively despite having heard the instructions hundreds of times. Another old habit: always pay attention to safety protocols. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule, and soon they were taxiing toward the runway. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently number 3 for takeoff," the captain's voice announced over the intercom. "Flight time to Denver tonight should be about 2 hours and 45 minutes. Weather looks good most of the way, though we're expecting some turbulence over the Rockies. We'll keep the seatbelt sign on until we reach our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The engines roared as the plane accelerated down the runway, pressing Ellie gently back into her seat. The familiar sensation of takeoff, that moment of suspension before the wheels left the ground, still gave her a small thrill. As they climbed through the clouds into the darkening sky, Ellie watched the city lights below grow smaller until they resembled the circuit board she had once designed. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, passengers began to move about the cabin. The businessman beside Ellie immediately stood and headed for the bathroom at the front of the plane. A flight attendant pushed a beverage cart down the aisle. "Something to drink?" the young woman asked when she reached Ellie's row. "Just water, please." Ellie accepted the plastic cup and tiny napkin with a thank you. 2 hours into the flight, most passengers had settled into their own routines, some sleeping, others watching movies on their screens, a few working on laptops. Ellie had finished several chapters of her mystery novel and was gazing out at the stars visible above the cloud layer when the plane suddenly dropped. "Several feet." The captain's voice came over the intercom, sounding tense but controlled. "Folks, we've hit some unexpected weather." "I'm turning the seatbelt sign back on. Flight attendants, please return to your seats." Ellie glanced at her watch. They should have been over eastern Colorado by now. She felt another bump, more severe this time, and several passengers gasped. The businessman who had returned to the seat beside her gripped the armrests tightly. "Happens all the time," Ellie said reassuringly. "Mountain air currents." The man nodded without looking convinced. The turbulence continued for several minutes, the plane occasionally dropping in a way that made stomachs lurch. A baby started crying somewhere in the back. Ellie remained calm, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She'd experienced far worse in experimental aircraft decades ago. When the intercom crackled to life again, the captain's voice had taken on a more serious tone. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a pressurization issue that requires us to descend to a lower altitude. As a precaution, we're going to divert to Peterson Air Force Base near Colorado Springs. We should be on the ground in about 20 minutes. This is strictly a precautionary measure, but I need everyone to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. A ripple of concerned murmurs spread through the cabin. The businessman turned to Ellie. An Air Force base? Can commercial planes even land there? Yes, Ellie replied simply. Military runways are typically longer than commercial ones. It's a safe option. What she didn't mention was that she knew Peterson well, too well. It had been nearly 15 years since she'd last set foot there, and she had hoped never to return. Ellie took a deep breath and tried to focus on her book, but the words blurred on the page. As the plane began its descent, Ellie put her book away and looked out the window. Through breaks in the clouds, she could make out the distinctive layout of the military base below, a sight both familiar and unsettling. She hadn't planned on ever returning to a place where people knew her by a different name and title. A place where her work had once been classified at the highest levels. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and ensuring tray tables were stowed. One stopped beside Ellie's row. Just a brief delay, she assured the passengers with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm sure we'll be back on our way to Denver soon. Ellie nodded but said nothing. She knew better than most how military protocols worked. Once they landed at Peterson, things would get complicated. Civilian aircraft didn't just pop in for a quick visit to Air Force bases without setting off a chain of security procedures. The landing was smooth despite the circumstances, a testament to the pilot's skill. As they taxied away from the runway, Ellie caught sight of a row of F-22 Raptors parked in the distance. Sleek, predatory shapes even in the dim evening light. She felt a flutter of something between pride and unease in her chest. Those planes represented years of her life's work. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain announced, we've landed safely at Peterson Air Force Base. Please remain seated while we coordinate with base personnel. We'll provide more information as soon as we have it. As the plane came to a stop on the tarmac, Ellie could see military vehicles approaching. She took off her reading glasses and tucked them into her bag, then pulled out a small case containing her other glasses, the ones with the prescription she actually needed rather than the reading glasses that completed her forgettable appearance. The moment of anonymity was about to end. Once base personnel came aboard and started checking IDs, someone would eventually notice the special designation code on her identification, a code that had been inactive for years, but never removed from the system. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, mentally preparing herself. She was no longer the quiet woman in seat 12F. In a matter of minutes, she would become Dr. Eleanor Chen again, the woman whose designs had revolutionized aerial combat systems and whose name still appeared in classified briefings at the Pentagon military. Vehicles surrounded the aircraft within minutes of landing. Through the small oval window, Ellie watched uniformed personnel speaking with the ground crew. The cabin remained unusually quiet, passengers exchanging worried glances as the wait stretched on. The businessman beside Ellie checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes. Great, he muttered. I'm going to miss my connection. Ellie said nothing. She knew from experience that military protocols couldn't be rushed. After 15 minutes, the cabin door finally opened, and 2 Air Force security officers stepped aboard, followed by the flight captain. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain announced, due to the nature of our emergency landing, base security requires identification from all passengers. This is standard procedure when civilians land on a military installation. We apologize for the inconvenience. A collective groan rose from the cabin. The lead security officer, a woman with lieutenant bars on her uniform, addressed the passengers. Good evening. I'm Lieutenant Reynolds. We'll be checking IDs row by row and escorting you to a secure waiting area while your aircraft is inspected. Please have your identification ready. The process began at the front of the plane. Ellie slipped her ID from her wallet. Running her thumb over the worn edges of the special government identification card she still carried alongside her regular driver's license. Few people knew that such cards existed, much less what the codes imprinted on them meant. Row by row, passengers presented their IDs and left the aircraft. When Lieutenant Reynolds reached row 12, the businessman showed his driver's license and company ID, then shuffled into the aisle, already on his phone trying to rebook his connection. Ellie handed over both her driver's license and the special ID card. "Both, please," she said quietly. Lieutenant Reynolds glanced at the driver's license first, nodding routinely. Then her eyes fell on the second card. She froze, her professional expression faltering for just a moment as she registered the alphanumeric code in the corner. "Ma'am," she said, her tone shifting subtly, "could you please wait until the other passengers have deplaned?" It wasn't really a question. "Of course," Ellie replied, settling back into her seat. Several curious passengers looked back as they filed out, wondering why the unremarkable woman was being held behind. Once the last passenger had left, Lieutenant Reynolds spoke into her radio, her voice too low for Ellie to hear. Within moments, a man in his 40s with captain's bars appeared at the cabin door. The lieutenant handed him Ellie's special ID. His eyes widened slightly as he read the designation. "Dr. Chen," he said, stepping forward with his hand extended. "Captain Miguel Ortiz, this is unexpected." "For both of us, Captain," Ellie replied, shaking his hand. "Would you mind coming with me? Base Commander Wilson will want to speak with you." Ellie gathered her bag and followed Captain Ortiz off the plane. Unlike the other passengers being herded toward a hangar in the distance, she was led to a waiting SUV with government plates. "It's been a while since you've been to Peterson, I imagine," Captain Ortiz said as they drove across the tarmac. 15 years, Ellie confirmed, watching the familiar buildings pass by. "Though not much seems to have changed. The aircraft have," he replied with a hint of pride. "We have a full squadron of Raptors now." The car stopped outside a modern building with reflective windows. As they entered, Ellie noticed how personnel in the lobby straightened when Captain Ortiz introduced her. A young airman nearly stumbled in his haste to hold the elevator door. The base commander's office was on the top floor, with a view of the airfield and the mountains beyond. Commander Wilson stood when they entered, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Dr. Chen," she said, stepping forward. "I'm Commander Patricia Wilson. When they told me who was on that commercial flight, I could hardly believe it. Just Ellie these days," she replied, accepting the commander's firm handshake. "I've been retired for some time." "Not according to your designation," Commander Wilson said with a knowing look. "That code doesn't expire. Please have a seat. Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Water would be fine," Ellie said, taking a chair opposite the commander's desk. Through the large windows, she could see her commercial airliner sitting isolated on the tarmac, maintenance crews already examining its exterior. Captain Ortiz returned with a glass of water, then excused himself, closing the door behind him. "I should explain the situation," Commander Wilson began, leaning forward. "Your flight diverted here because of a pressurization warning in the cockpit. Our mechanics are checking it now, but these things take time. The passengers will be bused to Colorado Springs Airport once we process them, and the airline will arrange alternative transportation to Denver." "I understand," Ellie nodded, "though I suspect you didn't bring me here just to tell me that." Commander Wilson smiled slightly. "No. Your presence here is significant. Your designation code is still active in our systems, Dr. Chen. Do you know how many people at this base would recognize that code?" "Not many, I would hope," Ellie replied. That was rather the point. 3, Commander Wilson said. "Myself, my Chief of Operations, and our Head of Flight System Security. And all 3 of us know exactly who you are and what you did. The rest just know to pay attention when that code appears." Ellie took a sip of water, trying to maintain her composure. She had left that life behind, or so she thought. "We have a situation," Commander Wilson continued, her voice lowered despite the privacy of her office. "One that coincidentally involves systems you designed. When your name came up on the manifest, it seemed like, well, some might call it fate." "I don't believe in fate, Commander," Ellie said, "and I'm not in that business anymore." "Perhaps not officially," Commander Wilson acknowledged, "but your expertise hasn't vanished. We've been experiencing anomalies in the targeting systems of 3 of our F-22s, the same targeting systems you designed." Ellie felt a flutter of professional curiosity despite herself. "What kind of anomalies?" "Ghost returns, Phantom targets appearing and disappearing. The tech team has been troubleshooting for weeks without success. Commander Wilson leaned back in her chair. Having you here, even briefly, it's an opportunity we can't ignore. Through the window, Ellie could see ground crews working around her plane. Those passengers would be stuck for hours while the maintenance check was completed. She was stuck too, but for different reasons. I'm not cleared anymore, Ellie pointed out. I haven't been inside a secure facility in over a decade. Commander Wilson tapped Ellie's special ID card sitting on her desk. This says otherwise. Your clearance never officially expired. It was placed in inactive status, but the designation remains valid. I can reactivate it with one phone call. Ellie stared at the ID, feeling the weight of her past pressing down on her. She had walked away from this world of classified projects and military hardware. She had built a quiet life teaching physics at a small college, grading papers and tending to her garden. No one there knew about her previous career designing weapon systems that changed modern warfare. One look, Commander Wilson said. That's all I'm asking. Your flight isn't going anywhere for at least 4 hours. You might spot something our people have missed. Before Ellie could respond, a knock came at the door. Captain Ortiz entered, followed by a younger officer with Lieutenant Colonel insignia. Dr. Chen, Captain Ortiz said, this is Lieutenant Colonel Rajesh Kumar, our squadron commander. The younger officer stepped forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Dr. Chen, he said, his voice almost reverent. It's an honor to meet you. Your work on the integrated weapon systems for the F-22 is legendary. Ellie felt uncomfortable with the attention. It was a team effort, Colonel. Many brilliant engineers contributed to those systems. But it was your breakthrough that made the neural tracking interface possible, he insisted. We still study your papers at the Academy. Commander Wilson watched the exchange with interest. Colonel Kumar's pilots are the ones experiencing the anomalies, she explained. Perhaps he could show you the flight data while your plane is being inspected. Ellie looked from the commander to the eager young colonel, then back to the commercial airliner sitting on the tarmac. Ellie felt a complex mix of emotions, pride that her work was still relevant, concern about the modifications made to her systems, and an unexpected thrill at being back in this world. Even temporarily, I'll need about an hour, she told them. The fix isn't complicated, but I want to make sure it doesn't create new problems. Of course, Commander Wilson nodded. Colonel Kumar, please give Dr. Chen whatever assistance she requires. Captain Rivera, I'd like you on standby to test the system once the modifications are complete. As the others filed out, Tom remained at his workstation, looking at Ellie with undisguised admiration. I can't believe I'm working with the Dr. Chen, he said. Wait until my professors hear about this. They won't, Commander Wilson said firmly from the doorway. This incident is classified. As far as anyone knows, Dr. Chen was just another passenger on a diverted commercial flight. When they were alone, Ellie settled into the chair in front of the main console. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Muscle memory from thousands of hours of coding slowly returning. Then she began to type, falling into a rhythm that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the mountains, casting long shadows across the airfield. In the distance, she could see her commercial airliner still sitting on the tarmac. The other passengers would be wondering about the delay, annoyed at the inconvenience. None of them would ever know that the quiet woman from seat 12F was currently bypassing multiple security protocols to access some of the most classified code in the military's arsenal, code she had written herself 15 years ago. The code on the screen blurred slightly as Ellie's eyes grew tired. She'd been working for nearly 40 minutes, diving deeper into the system than anyone had in years. Tom sat beside her, watching in silent amazement as her fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through security layers and system architecture with the confidence of someone who had built it from scratch. This is elegant, he finally said, breaking the silence. The way you structured the original safety protocols, it's like poetry. Ellie smiled slightly without taking her eyes off the screen. That's the nicest thing anyone said about my code in a long time. I don't understand why they changed it, Tom said, gesturing to the modified sections. Your original design was so balanced. Ellie's hands paused over the keyboard. Military technology is always evolving. There's constant pressure to make systems more aggressive, more sensitive. The people who push for these changes aren't in the cockpit. They're in conference rooms, looking at theoretical threat matrices. She continued typing. carefully restoring critical safety parameters while preserving necessary updates. The thing they forget is that these systems need to serve the pilots, not the other way around. A pilot overwhelmed with false positives will eventually start ignoring real threats. The door opened, and Colonel Kumar stepped in. "How's it coming along, Doctor?" "Almost there," Ellie replied without looking up. "I've identified the modified parameters and restored the original safety thresholds, but I'm also finding traces of other changes buried deeper in the code." Colonel Kumar moved closer, concern evident on his face. "What kind of changes?" "Someone's been tinkering with the core pattern recognition algorithms," she said, pointing to a section of code. "See these subroutines? They've been optimized beyond what I would consider safe parameters. The system is basically hallucinating threats because it's been told to find them at all costs." Tom leaned forward. "Who would authorize that kind of change?" "That's what I'd like to know," Ellie murmured, opening another window of code. "There should be a digital signature on any authorized modifications." She scrolled through several screens of data before stopping suddenly. "There it is, Dr. Alexander Reed, as expected. But there's another signature here. General Howard Thompson." Colonel Kumar's expression darkened. "General Thompson heads the Advanced Weapons Division. He wouldn't normally be involved in software updates." Ellie's fingers moved more rapidly now, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs through the system. "There's more. These changes weren't just pushed to your base. They've been deployed to every F-22 squadron worldwide. The implications hung in the air. Hundreds of aircraft carrying potentially compromised targeting systems. Pilots trusting equipment that might be feeding them false information. "Can you fix it?" Colonel Kumar asked quietly. "I already am," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the pressure. "I'm writing a patch that will restore the original safety parameters while preserving the legitimate improvements. But someone needs to investigate why these changes were made in the first place. Commander Wilson will want to know about this immediately," Colonel Kumar said, moving toward the door. "Keep working. I'll be back." When he was gone, Tom looked at Ellie with newfound respect. "You're risking a lot by doing this, aren't you? Going against changes approved by a general?" Ellie's eyes remained fixed on the screen. "The only thing I care about is making sure those pilots up there have systems they can trust. Politics isn't my concern." For the next 20 minutes, Ellie worked in focused silence, writing and testing code that would undo months of dangerous modifications without triggering security alerts throughout the system. It was delicate work, requiring knowledge only she possessed about how the original system had been designed. When Captain Rivera returned with Commander Wilson and Colonel Kumar, Ellie was making final adjustments to the patch. "Dr. Chen has discovered something concerning," Colonel Kumar told the commander in a low voice. "The anomalies weren't accidents. The system was deliberately modified to be overly sensitive." Commander Wilson's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened. "Who authorized it?" "General Thompson," Ellie answered without looking up from her work. "Along with my former colleague, Dr. Reed. They've pushed these changes to every F-22 in the fleet." Captain Rivera stepped forward. "What exactly did they change?" "They made the system see threats that aren't there," Ellie explained, finally turning to face them. "Imagine you're driving a car and suddenly your collision warning system starts blaring alerts about obstacles that don't exist. Eventually, you'd start ignoring the warnings, and that's when a real collision would happen." "Why would anyone do that?" Captain Rivera asked, confusion evident in her voice. Ellie hesitated. "I can think of several possibilities, none of them good. Best case scenario? Overzealous engineers thinking they're improving the system. Worst case?" She left the thought unfinished. Commander Wilson's jaw tightened. "Worst case is that someone wants our pilots to stop trusting their systems, or to respond to threats that don't exist." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implication sank in. "The patch is ready," Ellie said, breaking the tension. "I've restored the original safety parameters while preserving legitimate improvements from the last 15 years. The system will still be more sensitive than my original design, but within reasonable limits." "How do we test it?" Colonel Kumar asked. "We need to fly," Captain Rivera said immediately. "I can take up one of the affected aircraft and put the system through its paces." Commander Wilson nodded. "Make it happen, Colonel. Captain Rivera, you'll fly with the modified code. We need to know if Dr. Chen's patch resolves the issue." "What about the other bases?" Tom asked. "If every F-22 has this modification, one step at a time," Commander Wilson said firmly. "We test the patch here first. If it works, I'll take this up my chain of command. There are proper channels for this. As the others discussed logistics, Ellie finished uploading the patch to a secure server where it could be loaded into the aircraft's systems. A strange feeling washed over her, pride mixed with nostalgia and a touch of anger. The code she had written with such care had been twisted, altered for purposes she could only guess at. Captain Rivera approached her workstation. "Thank you for doing this," she said quietly. "Most of my squadron doesn't even know these anomalies are happening. We've been told to keep it quiet, just report them and continue normal operations." "That doesn't sound like standard procedure," Ellie noted, her concern growing. "It's not," Rivera confirmed. "That's why this means so much. We need to trust our equipment up there." 30 minutes later, they all stood in the Flight Operations Center, watching as Captain Rivera taxied an F-22 Raptor toward the runway. The sleek, angular aircraft looked almost predatory in the fading daylight, its stealth surfaces absorbing rather than reflecting the sunset. "The patch has been loaded," Tom confirmed, monitoring systems at his workstation. "All diagnostics are green." Commander Wilson stood beside Ellie, both women watching intently as the fighter jet began its takeoff roll. "You never told me why you left," she said quietly, her eyes still on the aircraft now accelerating down the runway. "Someone with your talents. You could have written your own ticket anywhere in the defense sector." Ellie watched as the F-22 lifted smoothly into the air, climbing rapidly into the darkening sky. "I saw where things were heading," she replied after a long moment. "Systems getting more autonomous, decisions being made faster than human reflexes. One day I realized I was designing myself into a corner, creating technology that would eventually make human judgment obsolete." On the radio, they could hear Captain Rivera's calm voice reporting her altitude and heading. The jet was now just a small point of light against the purple sky. "Technology is just a tool," Commander Wilson said. "It still takes people to decide how to use it." Ellie turned to look at the commander directly. "That's exactly my point. I wanted to make sure those decisions stayed with people, pilots, commanders, humans with judgment and ethics. When I started seeing pressure to remove those human elements from the loop, that's when I knew it was time to walk away." Before Commander Wilson could respond, Captain Rivera's voice came over the radio again. "Commencing test sequence Alpha," she reported, "running the system through standard threat recognition protocols." Everyone in the operations center fell silent, watching the data screens as the F-22 systems began processing the test scenarios. This was the moment of truth. Would Ellie's patch restore the proper balance to systems that had been pushed beyond safe limits? Ellie found herself holding her breath. 15 years of distance suddenly collapsed into this single moment of anticipation. Somewhere over the Colorado mountains, a pilot was trusting her code again, code she had written, abandoned, and now returned to fix. Time seemed to stretch as they waited for Captain Rivera's test results. The operations center remained unnaturally quiet. Everyone focused on the data screens showing the F-22's flight path and system diagnostics. Ellie stood perfectly still, her arms crossed, watching numbers and indicators that told a story few in the room could fully read. "Running pattern recognition sequence now." Rivera's voice came through the speakers, calm and professional, initiating standard threat matrix. On the main screen, they could see the targeting system activating, scanning the airspace around the aircraft for potential threats. This was the moment of truth. Would the system still see ghosts, or had Ellie's patch restored its proper function? "No anomalous returns," Rivera reported after 30 seconds. "Targeting system is operating within normal parameters." A collective breath of relief swept through the room. Tom gave a small fist pump at his workstation. Colonel Kumar nodded approvingly at Ellie. "Let's try a more complex scenario," Rivera continued, initiating threat pattern Delta. This was a more demanding test, multiple simulated targets approaching from different vectors, some real, some electronic decoys. The kind of chaotic environment pilots might face in actual combat. The tension in the room ratcheted up again as they waited. Ellie uncrossed her arms and stepped closer to the main display, her eyes scanning the data feeds. "All targets correctly identified and prioritized," Rivera reported, a note of satisfaction evident in her voice. "The system is distinguishing between real and false returns. No ghost targets, no anomalies." Commander Wilson turned to Ellie. "It worked." "It should," Ellie replied quietly. I built those safety protocols for a reason. Rivera's voice came through again, running final verification sequence. This is the exact scenario where I encountered multiple ghost targets yesterday. Everyone watched as the F-22 executed a series of tight maneuvers, its sensors at maximum sensitivity. The targeting system processed massive amounts of data, filtering and prioritizing potential threats while the patch Ellie had written maintained the delicate balance between sensitivity and accuracy. Test complete, Rivera announced after several tense minutes. The system is functioning perfectly. No false positives, no ghost targets. Dr. Chen's patch has completely resolved the issue. The operations center erupted in applause. Several technicians patted Tom on the back while Colonel Kumar shook Ellie's hand firmly. Bring her home, Captain, Commander Wilson instructed, unable to hide her relief. She turned to Ellie. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Ellie said. Just make sure this patch gets deployed to every affected aircraft. I'll do more than that, Commander Wilson replied, her expression hardening. I'll be making calls to find out why these modifications were made in the first place. As the F-22 began its approach for landing, Ellie glanced at her watch. Nearly 3 hours had passed since she'd first been brought to the commander's office. Her commercial flight would be ready to depart soon, the other passengers none the wiser about what had transpired. Your flight should be cleared to leave within the hour, Commander Wilson said, as if reading her thoughts. The maintenance crew finished their inspection some time ago. We've been holding it for you. Ellie nodded, suddenly feeling very tired. The intensity of the past few hours, the mental exertion of diving back into complex code she hadn't touched in years, it had all taken a toll. There's something else, Commander Wilson added, her voice lower. We received a call from the Pentagon while you were working. Word travels fast when someone with your designation code suddenly appears on a military base. Ellie tensed. What did they want? To speak with you. I told them you were assisting with a technical issue and would be departing shortly. They seemed surprised that you were cooperating. I'm sure they were, Ellie murmured. Commander Wilson studied her for a moment. You didn't just leave the program, did you? There was a disagreement. Ellie's gaze drifted to the window, where she could see the F-22 touching down on the runway, its landing gear sending up small puffs of smoke as the tires met concrete. I saw where things were heading, she said finally. More automation, less human oversight. Systems that could eventually make life or death decisions faster than any person could intervene. I raised concerns, wrote reports, suggested ethical guidelines. She shook her head slightly. Not everyone appreciated my perspective. Yet they never revoked your clearance or designation, Commander Wilson observed. Some bridges you can't afford to burn completely, Ellie replied. Even if you disagree with someone, you might still need their expertise someday. Like today. Like today, Ellie agreed. 40 minutes later, Ellie stood on the tarmac beside the commercial airliner that would finally complete its journey to Denver. The other passengers were already boarding, many looking irritated by the long delay. None of them had any idea what had transpired while they waited in the terminal. Commander Wilson had accompanied her to the plane, along with Colonel Kumar and Captain Rivera, still in her flight suit. The patch has been uploaded to secure servers, the commander told her. I've personally notified Air Force Cyber Command about the unauthorized modifications. They're launching an investigation. Thank you for everything, Dr. Chen, Captain Rivera said, extending her hand. What you did today will keep pilots safe. As Ellie shook her hand, she noticed something unexpected. A line of pilots had formed near the boarding stairs. 6 men and women in flight suits standing at attention. The F-22 pilots of Peterson Air Force Base, showing their respect in the only way military protocol allowed. They insisted, Colonel Kumar explained, with a small smile. Word got around about what you did? Ellie felt a lump form in her throat. After 15 years of anonymous civilian life, teaching physics to college students who had no idea of her past, this silent acknowledgement from the pilots who trusted their lives to her systems meant more than she had expected. Your seat is being held, Commander Wilson said. Though I have to warn you, after today you might be hearing from us again. Talents like yours don't go unnoticed, especially when they're needed. Ellie picked up her messenger bag. I have finals to grade next week. My students are expecting them. The commander smiled. Of course, but the offer stands. As Ellie walked toward the boarding stairs, the pilots remained at attention, their faces impassive but their posture conveying everything words could not. She nodded to them as she passed, a silent acceptance of their gratitude. The flight attendant at the door greeted her with the practiced politeness of someone managing delayed passengers. "Seat 12F, right? We've been holding it for you. Something about you helping with the aircraft inspection?" "Something like that," Ellie replied with a small smile. As she made her way down the aisle, the businessman from earlier glanced up from his tablet. "Where have you been?" "We've been stuck here for hours. Just helping with some technical issues," she said, sliding past him to the window seat. He returned to his tablet with a grunt, never knowing that the unremarkable woman beside him had just prevented a potential catastrophe in America's most advanced fighter jets, or that her code would now protect pilots around the world. Ellie settled into seat 12F as the cabin door closed and the pre-flight announcements began. Through the window she could see Commander Wilson and the others still standing on the tarmac. Colonel Kumar saluted as the plane began to push back, a gesture of respect Ellie hadn't received in 15 years. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Ellie reflected on the strange turn her journey had taken. She had boarded as a forgettable passenger in seat 12F, briefly returned to being Dr. Eleanor Chen, the brilliant system architect whose work had changed modern aerial combat, and now was transitioning back to Professor Chen, who would return to her small campus and grade physics exams on Monday. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the night sky. As the lights of Peterson Air Force Base fell away below, Ellie knew that something had changed. Her carefully maintained anonymity had been breached. The wall between her past and present lives cracked open. Somewhere in the Pentagon, people were now aware that she was still out there, still capable of understanding and fixing the system she had designed. Whether that was a good thing remained to be seen. For now, she was simply a passenger in seat 12F, flying to Denver under a sky full of stars, some of which were actually military satellites running code she had written decades ago. Ellie opened her mystery novel and began to read, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth.